fine? Because I thought it was some sort of translation, perhaps. No? No? Do you have it? Okay, cool. La tienes. Sí, está. ¿No está? ¿No está funcionando? I know, this is why I'm asking, because they said they were sort of like setting it up, but I'm not sure if it's. Okay, cool. Cool. Okay. So welcome. Good afternoon. This is a plenary. This is an interesting plenary, I think. The title of this plenary, as you know, it's African Worldviews and Human Nature Relationships, a dialogue with Michelle Present, right? And Safarani Uwingabire. Did I pronounce it okay? Okay. So we have two very interesting guests in this panel. And as I said, the topic is very interesting. My name is Ivan Lobo. I'm a professor here at the University of Los Andes in Bogota, here in Colombia. And the reason why I'm acting as a moderator of this panel, which is a term that I don't really like, is because my research is on Afro-Colombian communities in the Pacific region of Colombia. So I myself am very interested in this question of what do African cosmovisions or worldviews have to teach us in terms of human nature relationships, which is a core topic for this panel, right? For this plenary. So this is my short introduction, and welcome to the plenary. And we decided that each of us is going to introduce himself, right? So I'm just going to give it to my dear guests. They will introduce themselves, and then we will start with the plenary. We have planned sort of like a 5 or 6 part session. After these introductions, we will start with Safa doing sort of like a contextual introduction to the topic. Then we will move to Michelle, who will provide a conceptual framework specifically for this topic, for the topic of the plenary. Then we will have Safa do some comments on that, on Michelle's presentation, presentation. And then we will move to addressing 3 specific questions, which we think will help us discuss and debate this very interesting topic. And at the end, of course, the room will be open for you guys to contribute, ask questions, or sort of like engage in this conversation, because this is sort of like the spirit we want this space to have, a conversation, a dialogue, more than a presentation, okay? So that's the structure, that's the plan for today. And without further ado, I leave it to Safa.
Thank you, Ivan. As Ivan mentioned, my name is Zafarani Uwingari. I'm born and raised in Rwanda. I did all my studies in Rwanda, and after that I moved to France, where I'm now working. I'm a researcher working for French Institute of Research in Agriculture and Environment. And my background is in agricultural economics and agribusiness, but I'm now trying to be ecological economist. And my research focuses on economic valuation and nurture services, and trying to understand how we perceive the nature. And this topic, actually, I was invited by Jordan, the president of International Society of Ecological Economics, because I served with him on the board as a member of the board, and we reflected along when we were preparing the conference, and then we realized that it's something that can be of interest if we all have a discussion about worldviews and what about our relationship with nature and how do we think about this. So I will talk more about that after Michelle.
Thank you. So I'm Michelle Present, and I'm at the moment at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. And I've come a long way working with many environmental justice NGOs and in the area of sustainable development, and took a moment to pause from the activism and entered into the university, and in my 40s started this journey of a PhD where I did a lot of unlearning, and my work has shifted to more relational thinking and working through and past the dualisms and the separations that we have in our disciplinaries. And now I'm also partly coordinating this Just Transitions project, TRAJECTS, and many of us are here. And yeah, TRAJECTS also has our global academy in the strand. So before we, at least part of this conversation, I'd like for us to take a moment, and I'm going to open a call to notice and acknowledge the soil and the land. And so we are sitting in a place that's not very African. Or I suppose we should have been outside for our our conversation. So we're sitting in this auditorium with pillars, but I just want you to imagine we were sitting outside. Okay, so let's start by taking a deep breath in and out. I invite us to begin with a call to notice and acknowledge the land beneath our feet. Notice the energy of the earth and reflect on the indigenous peoples, the ancestors that occupied the land before colonialism and imperialism. I want us to also acknowledge many of the people that were taken from their territories in other parts of the world, especially the Caribbean and the African continent, and landed here in South America. I'd like us to imagine and allow us to hold the earth to support you and ground you. Take another deep breath in and out. We acknowledge the first indigenous peoples who lived on this land, who had a deeply relational understanding of connections to land, to each other, and to the natural world. Land, initially a place of reciprocity, exchange, generosity, and spirituality. Land has now become marked by violent land appropriation and displacement that took place. And it is important to recognize that the occupation of land simultaneously induced an epistemicide, and that is the erasure of many knowledges. This involved the erasure of plant knowledge, language, ecosystem knowledge. And it is important to recognize the memory and the need for restorative processes of the erased languages. So I want you to feel the earth beneath your feet. And so consider this a call to acknowledge the land, the waters, all non-human living and non-living beings, and begin to feel what it means to be in a respectful, relationship with land, indigenous peoples, and ancestors. Kangans is to say thank you in Khoi language, where I come from, the Southern African part of the African continent. Thank you. Okay, so now I change gear to the conversation.
Okay. Thank you so much, Michelle, for taking us in another world where we are in a room within a wall. We thought a little bit that we were like maybe outside in relation with the outer world a little bit. So back to our plenary session, I would like to give you the idea of what we thought it's going to be about. Basically, this plenary session is about worldviews as a basis for thought, emotion, and behavior which lead to actions. Specifically, we seek to reflect together with all of you on our personal belief about human nature relationships. If we can call it a relationship, because as we may all acknowledge, this human nature relationship has been like a little bit like a one-way street, where we can compare it to, like, let's say in a relationship, a couple relationship where only one partner gives and the other one takes. This never works, and we know it. So here, that's why it is actually important to base the foundation, as we may all have learned in school, maybe, with the Western thoughts of tradition. It has been always conceptualized based on human, especially an individual, which means that all decision making and all systems that have been built has been putting an individual up front. And as we can see, we realize that this kind of way of thinking doesn't work. And why we realize that, we tried to reimagine our relationship with nature. And by doing so, we found ways using, again, our way of thinking, which is mainstream way of thinking, saying, okay, what if we think about approaches, which is also underpinned our individualistic perspective, where we always thought about, okay, how do nature contribute to our happiness? Because we know it does, how can we give back? So again, with that, I think we have agreed that this is not working neither. So if we can name it, in economics, we used to call it utilitarianism. And as a source of inspiration and way of conceptualizing solutions to our bad relationship with nature. However, that's way of thinking is outdated. It doesn't represent how societies perceive the value of nature. So we then come to the conclusion that we need a new source of inspiration. We need to keep discussion about conceptualization that consider nature and biodiversity or non-humans. This is where the idea came from, and Michelle here will tell us more about what are the ways of being and doing. How can we get inspiration to inform our conceptualization in terms of finding solutions to global challenges which we are facing today? So thank you. So welcome, Michelle.
Thank you. Thank you, Safi. Yes, so I'm going to speak for about 15 minutes or so, and I was going to watch me because I can speak a lot. And yes, so I just want to give some context of the importance of having this discussion on Afro-cosmovisions and indigenous cosmovisions outside and beyond the dominance of Western ontologies and epistemologies. And so I'd want us to trouble a bit first the dominance of the Western cultures in the world. And I draw here from the gestures of the Decolonial Collective. And they say, from our decolonial perspective, which is informed and inspired by indigenous analysis and practice, that affirm that our current global problems are not related so much to the lack of knowledge, but to an inherently violent modern colonial habit of being. And they speak about 4 denials that many of us sit with. And these 4 denials are the denial of the systemic violence and complicity in harm, and the fact that our comforts and securities, this computer I'm using, our phones, etc., our securities and enjoyments are subsidized by the expropriation and exploitation elsewhere. So our benefits are often at the expense of other humans and other non-humans. The second denial is the denial of the limits of the planet and the fact that the planet cannot sustain exponential growth and consumption. So the idea that we must all play catch up and live in a way so-called middle-class lives is a misnomer, because we only have one planet. The third denial is the denial of our entanglement, and that is that there's an insistence of seeing, and that our is the Western modern mind, that particular kind of human, and that insistence sees ourselves as separate from each other and separate from the land and separate from the earth, rather than entangled and living with a wider metabolism. And the fourth denial is the denial of the depth and the magnitude of the problems we face. And most of us are seen and deeply entrenched in living on an earth that is becoming more hostile to humans. And so to quote from Jason Moore and Mattel, they say, we are living the consequences of a civilization built on cheap energy, a reality verified by climate change. And the political economy of cheap fuel has not only wrought immense human suffering, but has remade the planetary ecology. And we live in a world with a polycrisis, but one of our biggest crises and that we're facing is that the temperature of the earth is warming. And this world history that has separated humans from nature is situated in a world that sees nature only as resource, and a resource to be extracted, to be used, and that kind of thinking, it could go further, but many of the relational historical scholars speak about the 15th and 16th century in Europe, where there was this moment of a separation from a organic understanding of the earth to the separation of hierarchies and separation of subject, object, man, woman, human nature. And in a sense, our world is organized around our separations. Even the disciplines in our universities are organized in these sort of separate. So when I was studying botany, it was botany without people. And when I was I'm in the humanities now, and it's humanities without nature. So we live in these kind of separation. And this transformation has led to there are three fundamental histories in this transformation of separation that led to the rise of capitalism. The first is that human activity was transformed into labor power. So relationships to land was no longer relational. People, the peasants, had to work for rent and pay their masters. Land in itself became commodified as a property. So land changed from relational values to land as property. And the third historical key moment is the separation and alienation of knowledges, and how certain subjects, so science and geography, became maps to find resources, science to extract, and seeing the world as units of extraction. And so many of the knowledges that understand relationality and interconnectedness were seen as backward and exclusionary. And so I want to draw to you that we're in a moment that we need to look deeply at those knowledges that were erased, that were seen as backward, and draw on these knowledges to look at different approaches to our many struggles. And I want to refer to Karen Barad. Maybe some of you know her, a queer theorist, a scholar. And she speaks about the importance of tracing the entanglements of the violent histories of colonialism. And in this tracing, we must open up a practice of removing the erasures and remembering. And she says the idea of remembering and thinking of the past is not about going back to what was, but rather about the material reconfiguring over space, over time, over matters, in ways to do justice, to account for the devastation of colonialism, and to bring and produce new openings so that we may endure and open up to these different ways. And so I'd like to continue by referring to African cosmologies, indigenous cosmologies, and these two favorite scholars of mine, Jason Moore and Raj Patel, say that in English, there's no term for life-making or life-centric, but in many other languages, there are these terms. And I'm going to speak from my own perspective in the Southern Africa region. In Southern Africa, the Bantu language, in the Bantu languages, Ubuntu is a concept of understanding human fulfillment of togetherness, and understanding that, my existence, I exist because you exist, and we don't exist as individuals, but we exist as a collective. In the Shona language, there's a further idea of ukama, the relatedness of the entire cosmos, including the biophysical world. And so in many other indigenous languages, there are terms around life-making or understanding the collective. And just to expand a bit more on the concept of Ubuntu, this is premises on the understanding of personhood, which means that a full development of a person comes from a shared identity of humanity, fostered through a network of relationships. So not just an individual, but a network and a collective of relationships. And many of our African brothers and sisters, when they were removed from this continent and taken to other parts of the world, either in South America or so-called now North America, came as slaves. And I want to refer to the work of Sylvia Winters, and she speaks about what was happening in the slave plot, in the corner of the violence of the plantation economy. And she refers to in the plot, there was a relational way of being, of multi-species relationships, multiple forms of kinships, non-binary relationships, ways of relating to the soil that maintain the soil diversity. So the slave plot became an overriding focus of resistance to the plantation economy. And the relationship to the land is very contrary to the current sort of the current rational use of land, motivated by colonial thinking that promotes seizure, enclosure, privatization, intense cultivation, monocultures of land, commodification of land. What many of the West Africans brought with them was the concept of good use with the land, and that worked with spiritual principles, relational meanings to the land, and assured the connection through more than economic values. So land was sacred and land was spiritual. And so I want to draw on some key principles, because the approach here of thinking about Afro-cosmovisions is not just the African continent. It's cosmovisions across many indigenous perspectives. And I was working through what are those kind of values? What are these relational values? And through my own sort of research and tracing various indigenous relationships, particularly to land, some of the key principles are reciprocity. And the idea of reciprocity is not just an exchange, but an understanding of giving back. And so it's very different to an extractive relationship. And so in my own work now, I'm very, I guess, annoyed or irritated that in this energy transitions, the extractive relationship seems to be maintained. And so, and I ask a question always, how will these energy transitions change the social relationships of the plantations and the coal plants? And I'm not seeing a shift. And we're hoping that, you know, part of our discussion here, and this morning when we heard the majoress speaking of understanding this relational connections to land, the life affirming processes, the ideas of exchange, the ideas of the communal and the collective. So another principle is around respect. And respect and care. And we have become, in a world, a consumer world, in a world where we all need money, very focused on our individual needs or our individual families, and have lost the notion of a broader respect of earth care. And now, so the care is not only for ourselves or just our immediate family, but for the broader community of all life on earth. And a third principle is about regeneration. And in this conversations around energy transitions, there's a lot of talk about decarbonization or net zero. But how about thinking of restoring our carbon cycles and regenerating soil diversity, and so it shifts the idea of of like no carbon. Of course, we need carbons in everything, in our hoods, but what we need is to think in terms of cycles and flows, and so we begin a more regenerative approach. So I want to speak about the importance in ending about land and soil memory, and how we need to look to the land and hear its stories, because we know very well that the land has been degraded over the years of fertilizers, monocultures, industrial development. And part of African and indigenous cosmology is to see land as a relational place. And that if we see land in that way, we work with the land in ways that brings reciprocity. So this kind of thinking is informed. The relational practice is about remembering, reclaiming, reconstruction, and regenerating diverse ways and diverse forms of knowledges, which many indigenous ways and Black ecologies and Black geographies can bring to our place of learning and unlearning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Yeah, thanks for giving us something else, something new, at least to many of us who have been much exposed, I can use the term, to the mainstream source of knowledge. And you talked about something that captured my attention, like reciprocity, you know, and I exist because you exist. So this is a really interesting way of seeing and thinking. I think that we can build on, as especially I can put it at least for scientist society, and in the current state of affairs now, we know that everything, maybe when it comes as far as nature is concerned, is understood through values. While this term values, it's a subjective term. We all have different values. We all understand things in different way, specifically based on our background, our culture, our traditions, and our relation with our surrounding world. Then what does that mean? It means that if we have a limited exposure to different narratives, you can understand how limited what we can produce is, and it's case specific only. So that being said, at least in current literature, when we talk about values, most of us, we have a session tomorrow about values. That's why I'm not going to go deep about these things. But worldviews is also being included in what is called values in broader sense. And there's also broader values, which put this reciprocity, social justice, all principle of, let's say, guiding principles in life can include, which is also different. And what we somehow also we start to understand, it's just a starting, is that these worldviews can at least be grouped in different categories. So now we do understand about things like anthropocentric worldviews. We do understand things like bioecocentric worldviews. But there is also a term which is still in discussion, what it means exactly, but it's pluricentric values, which in my understanding can help us include relational values that Michelle explained so well. Why am I saying this? It's just to bring the discussion in the context as scientists, at least where we are in our current state of affairs in doing research and trying to help decision makers make decisions about protecting nature. So this being said, it means this is a progress in the sense that back then, we used to talk only with the term ecosystem services. Everyone can understand how limiting this was. And when we progressed just a little bit, we changed the terminology and we say nature contribution to people. Still, something sounds wrong, as you can understand. There is always this kind of dependency, and there is one, the unit in this way of thinking. It's still human societies. There's not human other people around the world that might be forgotten in the conceptualization. So as we continue these plenaries, please, I welcome still your thoughts about what we will talk and still talking about. But before I will leave the mic to Ivan to coordinate all this. Thank you.
Thank you, Safa. Okay, so I think we had a couple of very interesting contextual or introductory discussions or presentations. And with that in mind, we will move on to addressing 3 specific questions, which we think will help us enlighten this debate, right? And have a very productive discussion. And I'm going to start with the first question, which goes directly to the topic of this plenary. And the question is there anything specific to African cosmovisions or worldviews, if you wish, that can help us come up with different narratives to address the current socio-ecological crisis? What is specific about African cosmovisions that can actually help us deal with the current crisis? This is my first question, and then I will invite Safa and Michelle to share their views on this first question of our discussion. Who wants to go first?
Thanks, Iva. And just to say, we also opened it to the floor to help us contextualize these questions. So I want to refer to 2, I think, astute African scholars. And one of the scholars is a Kenyan novelist and critique, Ngui wa Thiong'o. And he says this: they knew how to take but not give back to the soil. And that they're referring to is the colonists, minds that came and took out. And this is a very important aspect about and of African cosmovisions, but as I said, it relates much more broadly to many indigenous cosmovisions, and that is the idea of giving back, and not this kind of extractive logic of just taking and just thinking that the earth in a way is limitless. And in this way of thinking helps us to reimagine our relationships with food, with land, with energy, in ways that it changes how we begin to produce and also consume differently. And this also for me links quite closely to some of the principles I want to say beyond vive of understanding what do we need that's enough? How do we produce in harmony with nature? Another core scholar is the late Danny Nabudira. He was a Ugandan scholar, and he wrote this incredible book. It's called Afroecology, and he doesn't see Afroecology just for the African continent, but it is a way it brings insight to a worldview of wholeness and holism that he says emerged from the ancient African perspective. And in a sense, African ecology seeks to retrace the evolution and knowledge and wisdom from its source to the current epistemologies, and tries to situate them in a historical and cultural context, especially with a view of establishing a new science for generating and accessing knowledges for sustainable use. So it's not the kind of science that sees things as units to be extracted for constant, the human enterprise or utilitarian use. So again, it's a way of relating to things and matter in this kind of relational sense and a sense of wholeness.
Well, yeah, what I can say about that is, to me, at least, my understanding is how we relate with the other impact the way we behave towards the other. I will explain this by a study that I saw recently by Lordan and Bagatum, where they were explaining how, for example, if we look at the slavery, how it happened and why it happened, it somehow gives us some kind of hope, at least to me, because why the people were treated the way they were treated, it was one of the reasons because these people were not related. They were not seeing the slaves as their equal. They were not seeing slaves as human as they were defining themselves. So doing what they did, when we look at that now, we are ashamed as human beings. Like, how was that possible? How sad that story was. But to them, I assume back then, it was business as usual. So referring to that, if we look at nature as a resource to extract now, probably in the future, we will also have to ask ourselves and be ashamed by the way we do treat the nature. So that's what I can say about that. It's as Michelle explained somehow quite well, the relationship we have with the nature will help us also behave the way we should be doing.
Thank you, Safa. Second question I want to address, it's a question we were discussing when we were preparing the panel, and I think, we think, it's a particularly important question for the historical moment we're in. And the question is, we seem to agree that we need to bridge different epistemologies or ontologies or worldviews to overcome the current crisis. That seems to be a consensus, let's say, at least among people like us. However, the question for us is, how can those bridges be built when worldviews are so deeply ingrained into our identities? And we as people tend to be very protective of our identities, our worldviews, because that is deeply rooted into who we are and what our identities are. So it's a question of the process, the how, because again, we hear it over and over. We have to bridge those gaps. We have to have different worldviews talk to one another, dialogue, build bridges. How can we do that when our own worldviews are so deeply ingrained into who we are and we're so protective with those identities? That's the question that I want to address. Who wants to go first?
Thank you. I said I will go fast because I have just a simple answer to this. We have to listen to each other, first of all, to be able to even acknowledge our, how I can call them commonalities. I think and I believe real that we all come from different backgrounds. We all come from different traditions, but we still have some stuff in common. What if we start from there and create space where all voices are heard and are equal? This maybe it's a starting point to try to capitalize on what makes us humans and be grounded on how we are related and interconnected, in fact. Thank you.
So, yeah, so I mean, we only really planting seeds here. These are deep and big questions, but in my research, there seems to be an understanding on a sort of more philosophical level of the importance of human in nature relationships. But what's seems to be lacking is a methodologies to move beyond the dualisms and the separations of humanity and nature. And so a big part of how we shift our thinking is to think about both and rather than this either or approach, or even the notions of trade-offs that you always hear in the sustainable development discourse. And that both and means a deep opening to the respect and acknowledgement of other knowledges and other ways of being. And so it's at the university that I'm in, at the University of Cape Town, we have this new unit, the Koi and the Sand unit, but yet it's very distant from the discussions on energy or the discussions on food or even the sustainability discussions on campus. And we have this difficulty of the cultural box of the Koi and the Sand peoples, and I guess I appeal for those of us, especially at universities that are situated in separations and disciplines, is that we need to also think about how we give agency to the non-humans. And so we need to understand and look at what is the land telling us about our situation. What I had a discussion, or sort of interview with someone from Medellin, and she's working on the project on the glaciers, the mountains, and the glaciers are melting. And a lot of that work is also thinking is, what is the mountain telling us about our situation? And we are really so stuck in a methodologies at universities around quantitative and qualitative, and we forget to listen to stories and narratives, and look much more broadly to what the non-human worlds are telling us about the current situation.
I'm going to take that answer from Michelle to pose the last question and then open to the floor for you guys to raise your questions, commentaries, contributions. And that last question has to do with the institution we're in, and the institution of which many of us are part, which are universities. The central institutions on which society relies for the production of knowledge. And many of the discussions we've been having here have to do with, this divide between epistemological realms, meaning where is knowledge produced, what kind of knowledge is legitimate, and who is allowed to produce what kind of knowledges. So the question goes precisely to the role of universities, because again, it's an institution with which we're all, or most of us, very familiar. And the question is, what is it that has to change specifically in the role of universities as producers of knowledge in society to become more open to alternative narratives that embrace relational values and relational ontologies? Because again, I think, agree that universities still play an important role in the production of knowledge. So what is it that has to change in the role they play, in the things they do and how they do things, how they produce knowledge? This is the question that I want to pose, and then we will open the discussion to the floor.
Well, what a question. This is an interesting question because it's remind one of our role in all these. So what can university somehow accompany what we have been talking about in this session? I think, first of all, it has to acknowledge that richness of philosophies when it comes to the way of being and the way of living. By doing so, I think then even those few who tries to integrate in their conceptualization these non-mainstream concepts and knowledge, then to have at least space and support so that that can go forward. That's one of the way maybe I see this can be possible. That being said, I think we can also acknowledge the effort of the University of Magdalena of doing that. Maybe this is something that have to be take to other universities and also give some inspiration. Thank you.
Thanks. So I just want to say, in another part of my life, I feel like I am the multiple person, but I have a friend, a comrade in ecoversities. Wangui is over here, and the ecoversity is kind of opposite to the university, and it's it's a space of unlearning, unteaching, working with the non-human world and debunking the expert for one. So part of our big challenge is to overcome this kind of disciplinary experts that's organized in the university. And lots of universities are speaking about transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary. And yesterday we had a conversation with the chancellor here at the Magdalena University, and was speaking about their transdisciplinary programs and the incorporation of indigenous views in conversations with all these transitions, energy transitions, and so we don't really know how to do this but we have to be open to also making mistakes, but we're going to make different mistakes. And I want to add on to the acknowledgement of the importance of indigenous knowledges, peoples, Black peoples, brown peoples, anti-colonial, the abolitionist movements that support a way of being of wholeness and communal and life-centric. And so, so that the work that we do, and I'm going to refer to Arturo Escobar's work, is around the pluriversal design. And so the work is thinking together around how are we going to design food systems. And I want to say indigenous peoples, men and women, already know, and they've been doing it, and it will mean we have to let go and also grieve a lot of our securities, or the ideas of how do you get food, which is like just by the supermarket, or yeah, or our, electricity, and so it's going to mean ideas of less is more. And I think that for the university to be relevant, it's going to really have to be open to these different ways of thinking, and bring in the more diverse and pluriversal ideas and design.
Just to add one tiny thing, actually, there is also a culture, if I can put it like that, that the majority culture, which means that we have heard many times, for example, in doing research, in data collection, where when we aggregate, we end up by the major, let's say, voice, I can put it like that. But I think in shifting and also trying to acknowledge other narratives, I think the methodologically speaking, we need also to acknowledge actually that even one single voice that is different should be reported as a result, and should be also used as a source of information that we need to base on in, thinking and having processes about the decision making. Why this is important to me is that actually, at least in social sciences, some do well with this and acknowledge these qualitative information, but most of the time, and the way we have learned, we like the majority perspective, which make us lose much in terms of diversity and end up in specialization, which is the way it is. And I hope at least we seem not to agree with the outputs it provides, but also to be somehow, I'm hopeful that things will move. And I will also remind us that in these things, Michelle said that we don't know how to do this. We know that we need different values. We know that we are better than what we deliver in terms of conceptualization. But I also remember that currently, at least in current state of affairs, we know that many people are looking for better products, acknowledging that these ways of producing food and so forth and so on. But the business doesn't know how to do it, at least when they ask people to conceptualize and help them to include that we don't have tools neither. So maybe we need to be humble and say we don't know for now, and be willing to include those values, and also to be able maybe to accompany the change that we want.
Thank you, Safa. And Michelle, so let me just open the space for you to engage in the discussion. So if any of you have any question or commentary or a contribution, I see one hand. Do you want to come or to one? Yes, I can go. It's fine. It's fine.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Alison Guzman. I currently live in Chile, and I work with Mapuche communities in the coastal part of southern Chile. I have had the opportunity and privileged to have grown up in Southern Africa. I lived in Mozambique and South Africa, actually, in Pretoria. So, thank you for your presentation, and thank you for the good questions. I have two questions, actually. The first one is linked to, well, what do you think is the biggest challenge to the survival and revitalization of African-led thought and ways of thinking? So that's the first question. And then the second question is linked to transition minerals, talking about energy. How do you potentiate knowledge of the quote unquote African thought as part of the quote unquote global South to mitigate and address new forms of energy at the expense of communities and knowledge? Thank you.
I have the song in my mind from Bob Marley, Redemption Song, when you ask the question, and there's a line about something about we have to kind of remove ourselves from mental slavery. And I think one of the biggest challenges, and I find that with some of my students, is the work of decolonizing the mind. And I think there's so many entrappings of, you know, the promises of development and modernity. And while I want to say, you know, in the cracks of there's a yearning for relationality that has been lost and erased. But so I'd say the biggest challenge is about decolonizing the mind and remembering the ways and the knowledges and the relationality that we've been talking about that has been lost. And when we have that conversation, you know, it's never about going back to, you know, live in the past, or, you know, people sometimes, if I have this conversation, they'd say, oh, do you want us to go live in huts? Or but it, you know, that's not the going back to, yeah, it, you know, it is this kind of values of the care and the collective, and that we need to kind of reinstore, you know, as we reorganize ourselves. So yeah, that would be my question around. Yeah, I see my colleague Jenny that was on the panel on the on the transitions, the minerals, and that's a really, again, it's challenging because the continent is the continent that has all these critical minerals, and also the very people or countries, the hegemonic countries in Europe and the states that you know, want these are seeming to do it on the same basis of the extraction of the gold or the extraction of the coal. And I'm not sure we can depend on you know, our African governments to steer a different course. And so, yeah, I mean, a lot of this, so a lot of this, I want to say the conversations must also be with the consumers of the so-called global North. And they also have a responsibility. And, you know, if they're not thinking about, you know, how these minerals are extracted in the Democratic Congo Republic, or I know that Germany is very big now on hydrogen energy to be exported for electric cars. Yes, so I want to say there is a responsibility for those consumers as well to, yeah, to change the discourse of this kind of extractive, and so we don't have a repeat of the plantation and the coal plants.
It's fine. We had another one, right? Oh, okay. Anyone else? Yes, we have one there.
Por favor, hacen la traducción. ¿Aló? Hola, hola. ¿Ya? No, pedir es el favor si de pronto te hacen la traducción, pero
So if you could translate.
mucho a Wangari Maathai cuando estábamos hablando de las
I remember
relaciones
Wangari Maathai when we were talking about
y
relations
escuchar la naturaleza
and
y poner
listening to
la
nature.
voz. Entonces, ¿quién habla de la naturaleza?
So who
Y
speaks
la
from
que
nature?
decía Wangari era,
Something that
yo veo que
Wangari
un niño
mentioned
está hambre,
is if I see that a
si yo
child
veo
is
que una
going
comunidad
hungry,
se está desplazando,
if I see that a community is
entonces
being
está diciendo la
displaced,
naturaleza
what
que
is
tienes
nature
que irte,
saying?
que te tienes que
That
desplazar.
you have to leave, yeah, you have to displace for whatever reason.
Ahí también la naturaleza está hablando.
And
Y
there
de esa
nature is
manera
also
estamos
talking.
viendo
And that way
escuchar la
we
naturaleza es
are
escucharnos
seeing
a
that
nosotros.
hearing nature is hearing ourselves as a
Y ese
society.
reto que
And
tenemos
that
en este
challenge
pluriverso
of that
a veces lo
pluriverse,
complejizamos.
we make
En
it
la
too complex. And
academia
in the academy,
cerramos el
academia,
discurso en la
we
universidad,
are
pero hay
centering this discourse
otros
on
que
university,
estamos
and there are
trabajando en
others that
otras
are working on
instituciones
at other
que
institutions
estamos dialogando todos los días con la
that we are
comunidad,
discussing every
que
day or
estamos
dialoguing every day
apoyando
with the community,
el
and
emprendimiento,
we are
estamos
taking care of
apoyando
the
economías de
displacement,
base,
the
estamos llegando a
grassroots
acuerdos
economies, and we are reaching
por no estar en la
agreements.
universidad.
And
Ese
since we're not
discurso,
at the university,
esa
then
voz
that
está
voice
hecha en
is
crear conocimiento.
not taking into account that
Y
knowledge that
ahí
we're
es
creating.
donde
And
también la universidad tiene
that's
entonces el
where
reto
the university also has a
de
challenge.
escuchar a esos
Uh,
otros que estamos creando ese conocimiento,
we are creating that knowledge
cómo estamos
and
traduciendo esa voz
how
de la
we are
naturaleza
taking
en
that voice
una
from
realidad
nature
que
into
plantea
a
un
reality
conflicto
that
que
presents a
bien Joan
conflict
lo mencionó
that
ayer.
Joanne mentioned
El
yesterday.
desplazamiento está en África, está
The
en
displacement is
Colombia,
in Africa, it's in
está en
Colombia,
Ucrania, está en
it's in
Palestina
Ukraine, in Palestine.
y entonces el conflicto es del otro.
And the thing there is that
Y
the
la
conflict
naturaleza
happens
es
to
de
others,
nosotros.
and
Pero
that's
y
nature in other
entonces
parts.
ellos no son también humanos
But aren't they human as
y
well?
los humanos no hacemos también parte de la naturaleza.
And humans aren't part of nature?
Entonces, donde hacemos ese círculo
So
que cabemos todos con nuestras
where is
diferencias
that circle where all of us
y
have
es
room
por eso
with
que
our
hago
differences?
también entonces la
So
invitación a
that's why I
que
would
esos
like to
otros diálogos
invite for those other dialogues
sean escuchados
to be
y en
heard,
las distintas
and
narrativas
in the different
pluriversos
narratives in that pluriverse,
puedan verse que esas experiencias son
we
tan
can see
valiosas
those experiences that
para
they are so
conservar lo
valuable
que
to
somos como
conserve
cultura y
what
conservar
we
lo que
are
somos en nuestro territorio.
as a culture and in our territory.
I'm not sure I'm going to be able to translate that. I'll do my best, I promise. It was more a commentary than yeah, comments than a question. But essentially, he's saying his main question is who speaks about nature, and how do we listen to what nature is saying? For instance, when there is suffering, right? That you can see nature speaking through those things, the things that happen, right? Help me, go on. Oh, okay. And then he raised a very interesting point, because one of the questions was focused, as you heard, on the role of universities. But he was saying, what about the people like you, I think, that do not belong to a university, and yet we're in constant contact with communities, and we are creating forms of knowledge as well. So the fact that we do not belong to these mainstream institutions, as I'm going to say a metaphor of the core topic of our plenary, right? The people outside mainstream institutions, they're creating knowledge, and those knowledges are not heard, are not considered, not included, right? So this is not what he said, but this is sort of my realization. There are different levels in which we see the same phenomenon, which is the exclusion of certain forms of knowledge, right? And the implications of that form of exclusion at different levels, say continents, the African continent versus other continents, say mindsets or worldviews, or institutions, right? It's the same phenomenon on different levels, but it's, I think, addresses the same core question that we're trying to discuss in this plenary. How can we make those knowledges visible acknowledged, as Safa was saying, right? So he ended with this idea of an invitation for those dialogues and knowledges to actually be heard, not just discursively, but in reality. How do you factually make those knowledges heard, acknowledged, and included into, let's say, mainstream institutions for the production of knowledge? Okay. Yeah, so I think we have time. Yeah, we still have time, more 10 minutes. So go on, your question.
I have to say that I love the analogy between slavery and the way we treat nature right now. But in that sense, I would like to ask you, what would you consider that could be an important step to get there faster? Because probably in the future, we will feel ashamed of the global detrimental of ecosystem services. That's a reality. And that will be like a very big problem for the future generations. So how will we get there? Because it's very related with the previous question, because slavery ends because every free slave has a voice. So the change was like natural in a broader sense, but nature doesn't have a voice, or at least I don't understand it. The common people don't understand it, don't hear it. So how we get there?
Thanks. Interesting. Well, the analogy actually I can respond from there. I think slaves had voice, but nobody was willing to listen to that. And I don't think it's for their will that it ended. So somebody who had a voice raised his voice for them. So that's part of the answer. But as for nature, it doesn't have a voice. Then I think we don't know how to listen to nature. This is mainly the program. This is how I can put it. That's why one of the reason we thought about this plenary is to have these other ways of being and doing, where they seem to have a way to listen to nature and maybe to be in communion and to have this kind of relationship. Of course, I cannot really have a real answer, as you understand. I don't have it, but I think we have to learn to listen to nature as well. That's part of the answer. And anyway, also understand that those who doesn't have a voice doesn't mean that we have to, to do horrible stuff for them. So that's just a simple answer.
Yeah, I just want to add that point is that, and the we we're talking about is not the majorists or the indigenous we, it's the modernist we that forgot or how to listen to nature, because we've been separated from nature. So I always like to, with this whole notion of the Anthropocene, that we all not to blame. It's a certain type of human, a colonial, extractive, Western modernist human. But I want to, maybe some of you have read the book of Robin Kimmerer. It's indigenous wisdom, scientific knowledge, and the teachings of plant knowledge. And so there's many ways of listening to the land teachings. And she says that the land is broken, and more importantly, our relationships to the land is broken. And so our relationship to the land cannot heal until we hear its stories. And you know, in a different way, I'd like us to have our hands in the soil, and we can feel a soil that is in a way dying or dead soil compared to a soil that is diverse with insects and bacteria and earthworms, and it's diverse. And so you know, that's the closeness that we have to go to, yeah, to see. And we can see all the many floods or fires. That's yeah, so something's happening to this earth, and it's that kind of listening. So, and that will, if we can listen deeply, it will change the way then we can respond differently, and not in this techno-scientific way that's currently so prevalent.
One more we have, yeah, come on.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Sebastian. I am a economics student of Cali, Universidad del Valle. And as a student, I would like to question about sometimes in economics, we listen so often that policymakers need like mathematic bases or models or something like have to like where to say about. I don't know how to put in words right now, but also we need to have the data. So we need numbers, we need some mathematical function, and I would like to ask about how we can use the nature and its voice and other voices that have a like other structure more transcendental than mathematics, to use it in making policy, to work on these problems, to work on this crisis, because sometimes we think about it and we have some struggles to find a way of put something like abstract into a model that is more theoretical, more strict. I don't know how to put it, but it's more like a box, you know, like a square for some. I don't know how to explain it well, but I hope it understand.
Don't worry, we heard you very well. This is a very classic challenge, if I want to put it like that. Like, we want to be pragmatic, right? To resolve complex issue. That's the program, in fact, in itself. So, well, I will answer you using an example of a study that I did. I used modeling, classical. So, and when I was doing that, yeah, decision makers need somehow support to make their stuff. And they wanted us to tell them how people in the area, it's in south of France, they are willing to protect biodiversity using pollinators. So we did, as we know how to do things, using stated preference. And then we went to the people and asked them, what do you think about wild pollinators? How to try to find attributes, you know, classical, using what we know how to do. An interesting thing popped up. People were keen in protecting wild pollinators just in their own right. They didn't want anything else from them, just to protect them because they exist. And then we went back to the lab and say, we have this thing, how do we do it? It is not how we were planning to do our design. You know, we wanted, you know, the contribution to the food, to production, pragmatic things. And then we had the data, so we were obliged to include it in our design. Why? Because we realized that whatever question we will be asking people, they will be saying, yes, we want to contribute. Not because they are caring about whatever we will put on our list, kind of their contribution to production, to the variety of food, to the nice landscape. No, just because they want them to be there. They want to feel that they did something to protect for them biodiversity through wild pollinators. So this paper got a challenge to be published, as you can understand, because reviewers were not found to review this kind of work. So in framework, we don't put this. It's not how economics taught us. You know, where does it fit? We cannot relate to all kind of problem with methodology and struggle. So I think this is one of the reasons why that ecological economics really have to exist, where we can still try to think out of the box and do things otherwise and try mistakes, as Michelle said, and maybe we will pass through. That's my answer. Just one. The person behind it. Yeah. Who?
Yeah, I think what you just said, to think outside of the box, it's really difficult. And my concern is I'm working about the curriculum in the universities. And I think there is a big, huge place where we have to make the big changes. And I loved your question, because it's really important to see how we can put the basis for new rationalities. But that means that we have to see how we reproduce the rationalities in our curriculum. And the point is, and that was a little bit my reflections for the first try of to speak here. But the point is, where are we doing the deep philosophical discussions to make it possible to change the theories which we are reproducing in the curricula, so that we can have really a change. So I will not be the day of tomorrow indigenous person. No, we are modern, and we grew up in this epistemological place. But what we can do is to learn and to listen, which is also very difficult. And to listen means for me to make an horizontal dialogue with the other different, and to see how can I change, how can we change our framework to make possible a different world and a different rationality. And I think this spaces, yes, it's also have to have a place to make this deep philosophical questions and dialogues to make different knowledges possible. That's the point. The question is always, how can we do it different? How are we going to do that? But this rationalities, and you said also something very important to say, well, where is the mainstreams, the concepts? So where can we publish that? So the pairs which are reading us, that is knowledge of the coloniality of knowledge, which is very clear where to publish and where not to publish. And I have to have this structure of the article, and if it's not, you're not published. And if you're not published, you don't exist. So we have to create also different places were to hear us. And I was saying, I was before many years ago in other ecological economical meetings here, Redibek, and that was totally different what we were hearing that 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So it's very important to have this place now. Here we are in economical ecology, economía ecológica, yeah. And we are taking this, we are doing these questions. That is very valuable. But I think we have to still go deeper, and deeper is going also philosophical and theoretical to make possible different frameworks with the different rationalities. And that is the point. And that is not easy, but yes, to change our curriculums. And one last point is the creativity, because we have to be creative to think outside the box. And in the universities, we are also not incentivizing the creativity.
Okay, so we have to close now. And she was saying that now we have to go to what place? ¿A qué lugar dijiste que vamos? Mar Caribe? Mar Caribe, I don't know what that is. Okay, someplace over there, because there is a snack there for us, una merienda, right? Okay, so let me just close. Normally the role of the moderator or the chair is to wrap up and say, these are the takeaways. This is the things you should take away with you, because this is the important things. I'm not going to do that because that would be contradictory to what we have been discussing in this particular plenary, right? I will just invite you, if anyone, just one person wants to say very briefly, what is your takeaway from this plenary? A very simple, succinct idea that you take away from this plenary. What would that be? Anyone? And we close the session. Yes, we have one there.
To perceive the nature with all our senses and with all our resources, and also to listen to those who are very linked and deeply linked with nature and with the world. Thanks.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. To me, Africa in this plenary was a metaphor, because yes, it was about African cosmovisions, but it was also, and perhaps more importantly, about knowledges that are outside of so-called legitimate institutions, right? So with that, I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank you for your questions and contributions. And of course, I want to thank our amazing guests, Safa and Michelle, for whom I ask you to. And they are telling me that you have to follow that woman over there because she's going to take us to the snack. Thank you.